Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Walker, and I'm a columnist for the Boston Globe, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our Black History Month Film Festival. Today, we'll be talking about the classic 1989 film Glory. Glory tells the story of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, the first Black regiment in the Civil War. As many of you know, the 54th Regiment was from Boston, so this story has enormous local resonance. The film stars Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, and Morgan Freeman, and follows the regiment from its formation in the Reedville section of Hyde Park through its climactic battle in South Carolina. Here to help us reflect on this story, we have a great panel today. It includes Edward Swift, the director of Glory, Leon Wilson, the president and CEO of the Museum of African American History, and U.S. Navy veteran Meredith Tuitt, commander of the William E. Carter American Legion Post 16 in Mattapan. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here with us. I'm going to ask questions for about the first 30 minutes, and audience members are also invited to ask questions for panelists using the Q&A function you'll find at the bottom of your screen. The session is being recorded, and it will be distributed after the event. But I'd first like to start with you, Ed. I want you to talk about the genesis of this project. How did Glory begin?
Oh gosh, well, I had been a student in Boston, and I had walked past the St. Gaudens Memorial all the time, and had glanced at it as one does to any monument without having given it a great deal of thought or understanding. I was maybe 18 years old or 19 years old at the time, and then years later I came upon the Lincoln Kirsten monograph that he wrote about Shaw. And so I read that, and then started reading deeper into the history, and of course just started to read about the 54th. And eventually I was able to convince a film studio to make the story. And it grew out of that, and the letters, Shaw's letters that are at the Houghton Library at Harvard, and various other sources that we were able to consult. And then had the opportunity to really meet so many really knowledgeable people about the events, and to sit with them, and including many of the reenactors. And one thing led to another, but it was maybe not, it took 20 years from the time that I'd walked past that statue to the time that we actually made the movie.
I know that you've been a successful TV producer before, but this was early in your directing career, right? Mm-hmm. Was it hard to get this movie made? It wasn't at that point all that well known a story.
No, it was actually not easy. One thing that was kind of amazing is that the 125th anniversary of the battle was taking place that summer in Gettysburg, and I was able to convince them to chip in a little bit of money to go film the reenactment. And I was able to take that footage, which was very impressive. They had about 8,000 or 9,000 people on the field, and artillery and whatever, so it looked good, and that helped a bit. The interesting thing about the story is, of course, when the story took place, it was enormously famous in Boston. William Carney, who had been the first Black Medal of Honor winner, had a school and a street named after him in Boston. It was very well known. But as politics changed, and as the busing issue came very central, and as there was all sorts of racist problems in Boston, it sort of fell into disrepair. And what had been a very famous story became less known. And that was almost reclaiming some bit of history, actually.
That's fascinating. Leon Wilson, can you talk to us, please, about the enduring sort of historical resonance of the story of the 54th Regiment that gets told in Glory?
Sure. The story of Glory, and I was fortunate many years ago to see the first showing of it in the Boston area. It reflects a unique kind of history. Clearly, there was not a great welcoming of the men of the 54th into the Civil War. The men of the 54th proceeded into this opportunity with a great deal of pride, a level of commitment, and understanding of racism that was very different than obviously what anyone other than the 54th and one other regiment, Black regiment, that was fighting in the war at that time. But I think it's important to note that this film was a really accurate depiction of what we know at the Museum of African American History to be the truth. It no way is going to capture, every element of the despair that goes with being treated as, less than a person. But it really did, I think, in a very historical and accurate fashion, reflect many of the things that we show at our museum on Beacon Hill about the 54th. It also is a reflection of, what you'll see if you visit the 54th Monument, just opposite, the public gardens and commons there. All of this is a reflection of, the difficulty in being a citizen who wants to participate fully as a US citizen. In a lot of ways, it's a reflection of where we are today.
Mhm.
It's a battle that we're still fighting. As was said in something I recently saw, racism was never confronted as directly as it need to have been. And if it were, some of what we're dealing with today in terms of corrective actions would not be necessary. And more than necessary, they wouldn't be essential. So that's a bit of how I view this, and also a reflection of the quality of the film itself. It was nice to go back and take a second look.
Well,
You will always miss something the first time.
yeah,
Next
well,
time, the
it's
second time.
funny for me is that, they asked if I had seen it recently. I hadn't seen it for 30 years. And to look at it again was to be reminded that these men were giving their lives in pursuit of a promise. And
Yes.
in fact, that promise has not yet been fulfilled. Obviously, it's still present. And to see that now, it took on even a greater poignancy for me.
Much the same for me.
Yes.
Mm.
Hey, Max, I wanted to ask you about why this film strikes such a chord with Black veterans. I mean, this is a world you spend your life in, and you spend your time with guys who are reenacting some of the things we see in Glory. Talk to me about what it is about this story that so resonates with veterans.
With us, it's foundation. Many of us, when we talk about African Americans and men and women of color in the military, we reflect back to a lot of our brothers and sisters, all to the Revolutionary, but we stand more proudly on the shoulders of the 54th, to know that to be the first infantry regiment formed of men of color, and give them that, and to be able to know that they had standing, and they did so much to open the doors for other people of color to be involved in the military, to be attached to the military, and to have pride about the uniform. Even though there was so many struggles, and still even when I went in, there was a lot of struggles still around color and the pigmentation of our skin and how we were treated compared to our comrades. We still talk about that. As before we started, I was talking to Mary and Ed about my 54th comrades who are members at my American Legion post, and when we do reenactments every year and we go down to the Shaw Memorial and we lay the wreaths and we do all of that, we do that out of the fact that we understand that they did so much for us as veterans, and we're honored and humbled to be able to talk about them in that manner, and we make sure, one of the things that I can honestly say, like right now, the 54th Regiment Memorial is under renovations and they're cleaning it. And that's because about a year or so ago, the 54th Regiment themselves, Lieutenant Benny White, who's passed on, and a few of the other members, pushed our elected officials and pushed the fact that we needed to constantly keep repair of it because it's been vandalized so many times. And that talks about the systemic racism that still exists, that people feel that they have the right to vandalize it.
Yeah, it does. One of the things I was thinking, I watched the movie yesterday for the first time in 32 years. And I was wondering, if you made this movie today in this era, what do you think would be different?
Wow, it's very interesting. I mean, in terms of technology, something I am sort of proud of is that it has no computer graphics in it. It's all real people. And I think there's something ineffable about that actually gives the movie something a little bit more human and enduring. But at the time that I made the movie, there was very significant pressure on me from the studio to create what I think they wanted to be a white savior narrative, was to say that this, man, this white guy came in and led them. And in fact, what people don't know about the history of making the movie is that they really obliged me to write and shoot a bunch of stuff about Robert Gould Shaw and his training, about him at Brook Farm and the abolitionist community, and then training and meeting, listening to Frederick Douglass speak, and any number of parts of the history. But it was a focus that was disproportionate to the story. And once I started working with the guys in the tent, with Denzel and Morgan and Andre, it was so clear that that was, the beating heart of this story, and needed to be more at the center. And that they were, understanding that they were representing in a very particular way that I could, that I had to really humble myself to try to understand. But what I did do is begin to write more for them and bring them more to the center of the story. And when I showed the movie to the studio, I cut the first 20 minutes that they had me shoot, and began, you'll see, it just begins with Matthew Broderick at Antietam, and then immediately, very quickly, meets Morgan, and then the regiment forms. And that's because sometimes movies or stories tell you what they want to be or what they need to be. And this movie needed to have them, at its center. And that's what happened. And I think today, I wouldn't have had that struggle. I think interesting culturally now, certainly, and even before Black Lives Matter, but given the number of Black artists who are being given opportunities to write and direct and star in stories, I think I would have, that would have been understood as something that should have been there from the very beginning.
Shaw was, in fact, kind of a shaky savior, wasn't he? I mean, his family had bought the commission, and this is not exactly like watching Eisenhower on screen.
No, and it's funny. I think Matthew understood that, and something about the fact that he's this young guy and he's callow and doesn't seem entirely comfortable. I think that helps a little bit. I think it helps you understand the fact that he wasn't necessarily gung ho about the whole thing.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to place this in a larger context in terms of the history of Black veterans. I mean, there's a lot about the history of Black veterans that's been rather overlooked, right?
They are. I am blessed to be a veteran myself. But in any case, and in respect to how veterans are viewed, I happen to have come along at a time when having been in the armed services was not necessarily an applauded matter. That just, I'll let you discern what time period that was based on looking at me and guessing my age, et cetera. But the reality is, here's a situation where men were anxious to go into battle. They were anxious to join the armed forces. They were anxious not to be heroic. They were anxious to really be an impact in what the future held for people of color. They were in a circumstance where they weren't just going off to war, they were fighting for an opportunity for them and people like them. And that's a very distinct and different circumstance than perhaps some of the, the warrior-like, war, presentations of today. I mean, this was all about not just surviving, this was all about changing the direction. This and I watched this film again, for the second time, and what caught me was a statement that went something like this: if you are caught, you'll be returned to slavery. Some of them were never in slavery. Mm-hmm. And so the whole issue of racism becomes, very, very prevalent under that kind of a circumstance. Not about slavery. It was just about out and out racism. And if in fact that you were found to be someone who was sympathetic to the cause, you would be killed. And this was a white person that they were aimed at, and those that were, others, in the Union Army at that point. All of these things give you that sense of fear as an individual. Today, they also give you some sense of what the pride must have been at that point. There was an honor to being a part of this. There was an honor to having, being able to set direction. by putting your life on the line. To me, those are those very important things. And there are also significantly aspects of what it's like to be in the armed forces today. But at that particular time, these were, husbands and brothers, and they were going, and sons, they were going off, not just to war, they were going off to change the course of freedom in the country. But that's a very distinctly different circumstance than might be the case today.
I was just thinking about the issue of Black patriotism as an issue, because when we watched the election and you saw the role of the Black electorate here, particularly say in Georgia or the many states in which that particular vote was so questioned, became such a focus, and yet was so important in the final result. I think in some way that's maybe why the film has a role still, because it is about the thing that you're talking about, that these people are believing in making this change, but of doing this, they were doing this for an America that didn't really exist yet.
And one that didn't appreciate them.
Right.
And yet still.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Denzel's character raises this question about 2/3 of the way through the film. What are we fighting for? What is it that we're going to win here?
Yeah.
And in a way, that question is still there, right?
And it's still, I'm sorry, Adrian, I just want to piggyback on Leon's statement there about veterans in the military piece. One of the things that jumped out to me, and those of us veterans who are still in service, within the public, part of what we talk about, and we talk about from the heart, we talk about that courage, we talk about that discipline and that structure. And in the movie, when Colonel Shaw said that the 54th were men who were fighting from the heart, fighting with courage, that resonated with me, because truly for them and for us today that are still joining the military, that's the reason. A lot of people think, oh, it's just because they want, going in to get that education. But no, a lot of us are joining the military because of that courage from the heart, wanted to do. And we still can't, there's no definitive answer for what they're fighting for. Is it the freedom? Is it the ability to, open a path for those that are coming? And so that's still our question. What are we fighting for? Is it, what are we standing for? And I think that's one of the reasons why Glory will always be a really, really profound movie for us to let our young people watch. Those people that, even within our communities of color, who don't believe that the military is the right way for people of color, we shouldn't join, they should watch this movie, because it says so much. It's so deep, and it's just so much. I love this movie.
Something I couldn't include in the story is the fact that Frederick Douglass had offered up his 2 sons to serve in the regiment, and they did. And that Douglass had in fact been very much sort of against Lincoln, and had been very much like sort of King was with Johnson about until the time that he was able to sign, was pressing him. And once he signed the Emancipation, suddenly he became the great advocate, for the regiment, and even going so far as to offer, his sons.
And I would also add that, and again, watching the film for a second time, I believe I saw the reflection of the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill, our very site, which is where Frederick Douglass did engage in the recruitment. So that real live space reflecting this actual history. And the film is so good at depicting those nuances. Mm-hmm. And somewhere in the film, if you watch it carefully, there's a reflection of how to deal with anger. Mm-hmm. Okay? And there's a reflection of how, when you're not ready to deal with anger as a youthful person, there is someone who steps in that's a little bit more seasoned. There's the reflection of pride, and how proud I am to have this uniform and be able to fight for my country. And then just the tolerance for, that statement that we talked about a while ago, and still yet not fully accepted by the country, but the anger, the frustration, the pride, and simply, the quality and the character. All those things come through in this film.
Well, those actors are more than just typical. Frankly, you know, Morgan Freeman, I remember the scene you're even describing when he's trying to stop the character that Denzel plays, or even earlier when Shaw confronts him. You know, these actors were able to give me benefit of their experience and their own research. There had been a lot of books. There was a wonderful book of oral histories called Bullwhip Days, because one could never really know what these guys sounded like, but they had really done their homework. And you know, Denzel's family, there's a preacher in his family. So when he got up to speak, he was touching something that was very personal, and they each brought something personal to it. Jimmy Kennedy as well, the guy who plays the one who stutters in the tent. His father had been a deacon, I think, and so you know, whether you're talking about pride, whether you're talking about religion, whether you're talking about anger, it came from personal places too, and that then somehow resonated to the more general issues.
Yeah. And Meredith and Leon, I wanted to ask you, as veterans, what was it like to watch the battle scenes in Glory?
Well, you know, I wasn't in battle, so I don't have any experience to speak to. But you know, it's a frightening, and I might have been. You know, I'll say that, but it's a frightening notion to be ready to do something that you know might be the last thing you do on earth. And I think that struck me again in watching the film. There's an anxiousness about, I want to get in there. I want to be a part of it. Yeah. I think that probably happens today, so I'll turn it over to somebody else who's probably more aligned with that feeling.
Yeah. So I can honestly say that as a jet mechanic, I worked on anti-submarine warfare planes when I first went in. And when I went in, I'm aging myself now, women were only allowed 2 weeks at a time and on the carriers. So I was able to touch a couple of the carriers during my time stationed in California. And I want to say I wasn't in battle anytime. Desert Storm, I was pregnant, so I couldn't go. I cried because I wanted to go, you know? And, but working on the flight line and working on the carrier deck, that fear is almost like, you know, anything can happen up there. And when I watched the battle scenes, I felt like, yeah, I want to be there, you know. And I've been out since '98, and I'm still like excited about the fact that, you know, being a part of something like that. And I was watching the scene saying, get up, come on, do this, you know. So I'm a radical veteran. I still want to go out there and you know, do some combat PT and do all of that. So I can say I'm a lover of the battle scene. Yeah. When Denzel's character picked up the flag after the colors, after he had said he didn't want to carry those colors, that meant so much to see the colors go down and for him to grab it. And he was like, I'm taking it. No matter what I think, I'm taking this colors. You know, that to me, that made the movie, you know, to see that here's this young man who didn't want to carry the colors for honors because he didn't believe that carrying it meant anything worthy. And then in the end, to see that the colors go down in such a battle like that, he was determined it was not going to stay down. And that to me is beautiful. Yeah.
You know, the man who picked up the flag, finally, the tattered battle flag, and crawled back to his own lines was this man named William Carney, who received the first Medal of Honor, the first Black man to receive the Medal of Honor, actually, for having done that.
Wow.
Yeah. We talk about him at the State House. We talk about him within a lot of our history, you know, veteran history, when we try to talk about African Americans who have made paths for us. And I love that. It's beautiful. Yeah. To do, there was a few years back, I don't know if you remember it, Adrian, when they did bringing the streamers back into the State House, and they did a reenactment of bringing the streamers back after the Civil War. I truly believe if we do that regularly, to just let our young people know and let other people know the struggles that went through for military and for military attached family members, that's that right there is something to see all those streamers come back. And when the 54th streamer walked back in with all the other flags and standing there just watching them, it was just such a, it was beautiful. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's great. Hey, I'm going to ask a few questions from the audience now before our time runs out, and we'll start with this one. The ending with the sand dune grave was moving, with the two so disconnected, but in the end connecting in the end. How was that final scene decided? Was it in the original script, or did it come out of production?
You know, there was a very famous historian, a man named Shelby Foote, who was one of
Sure.
he was one of my you know, sort of advisors in this, and in fact, it was based on history. They decided to bury them all together. The Southern officers at the time thought that that was a great disgrace, is that the white officers should be buried with their men. But later, Shaw's parents, when they were offered the chance to disinter the body and bring him back to Boston, they said, no, he should be left there with his men. You know, obviously, it's a little bit of dramaturgy to end up with the body of Denzel next to the body of Matthew. But there's something so remarkable even about that shot that we never could have planned, because they threw themselves in. And I think that what happens is their faces come to rest, literally almost cheek to cheek. And I remember sitting there, even to this day, all of us are watching this happen and we're shooting in slow motion. But as it happened, there was weeping. I mean, just all of us couldn't help but start to feel this thing happening, because there was something that was guiding that moment and that movie. And there it was, the culmination in that final moment as they're sort of at rest there.
Just out of curiosity, was it the last thing you shot?
I think it was the last part of the battle that we shot. I think I went back at the very end, and we went back to Atlanta, and I shot some of the Antietam stuff at Atlanta. But I think Denzel wasn't in it, because he was obviously not in at the Antietam. I think it was just Matthew and then Morgan when they meet sort of after the battle. So that was a bit of almost, it was the beginning that we shot almost as a kind of a postscript.
Wow. Another question from the audience. Historical movies often take liberties with some of the actual facts, as we know. What parts of the known history were altered in glory to tell a greater truth?
Well, it's one of those stories where the actual facts conform to dramatic shape in this beautiful way, which is to say, they were recruited, they were trained in the way they were told that they were not going to be given equal pay. They were warned that they would be shot. You know, the battle ends up, all of the biggest tent poles are there. Was a character like the character that Denzel plays, was he whipped? No, because they had stopped whipping in the Union Army just maybe the month or so before. They weren't given adequate shoes. There were, you know, the Colonel Montgomery was a much more complex character than I described him, I think. You know, and the men themselves, we didn't know who they were. That's me as a dramatist trying to write in these personalities. But I had a very interesting thing happen before we started shooting. I got a call from Kwasi Mfume, who wanted to come down on behalf of the Black Caucus and talk to me, you know, a young white liberal kid making this movie about the African-American experience. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to be interesting, and is it going to be confrontational? And in fact, he was exceedingly generous, but they said one thing. He said it was really important to us that the men, not be described as a monolith, that they come from so many different backgrounds, that there were professionals, that there were educated men, certainly, and there were men who were slaves. And that was our way of trying to serve that vision, I think, because we couldn't know who they were. So they were invented. And so some of the conflictual things are invented. But again, I mean, you know, you could talk about this better than I could. You know, there are conflicts of men at war where they have to, you know, they're coming from different backgrounds and they have to find each other and create a unit. And that's the thing to me that's beautiful when they do that shout, which is they come together and they realize they're doing this for each other. And that's the sort of the dramatic sort of melodrama that gets created in it.
How much do we really know about the guys, the men who were in the 54th Regiment? How much of their history survives?
Leon can talk about this now. They know a lot now. How many men were free men? How many were there were some who were, laborers? I think there's a great understanding of it now. I even saw an exhibit at the National Gallery a few years ago where they had letters from a lot of the different men who had gone down there.
Yeah, the 54th monument, the public gardens, if you care to walk by and simply read what's there, it'll give you some, clear sense of who they were. And my earlier statement, that they were not men necessarily who'd been enslaved. And as a matter of fact, coming from Boston, in most cases, not so, that they were simply volunteers. And I think it's important, and we can literally present much more of that from, the pieces we have at the museum. But, absolutely, a lot more is known. And there's such an incredible connection to today, where you see characters and not just, from the movie itself, which is remarkably well done, but you see characters going through their daily life and you don't really know what it is that's making them move in the direction they're moving in. You see soldiers going through their daily life. I remember that much from, my days as a soldier. You don't know who is next to you. All you know is it could be a circumstance where that person next to you has a lifestyle and a commitment to something that's deeper than just them surviving. They're there perhaps to help you survive. And I'm going to let someone else speak to that who's a more recent soldier.
It was mirrored to me by the fact that the men who came to work with me, these reenactors, came from all over. They were men from the military. There was a guy named Sergeant Mark Jones who was the Sergeant Major of the Army at that time. There were academics. There were lawyers. There were just people who wanted to be part of that, and they became the core of the guys who were reenacting in the movie. Some of them were real reenactors all the time, and others were just men who felt it was important for them to be part of this story because they knew it in that same spirit, I think.
Mhm.
It was a good, and some of the 54th guys here, as I was telling Ed earlier, because the reenactors had just recreated themselves in 1988, just before, and they talked about the filming and they talked about the ability of, a couple of them had went down to do some of the reenactment, so it was really a pleasure to be able to talk to them about it, So, and the only thing I missed in this, because the 54th didn't have any hidden female soldiers like the 38th Regiment, but it would have been nice to throw a little,
I read something recently. There was a woman named Charlotte Fortin, who was a very important educator, who was down there with the 54th.
Mhm.
And there was some story I read recently. There was another Black regiment later that Harriet Tubman helped guide at some point through some swamps at some point,
Yeah.
I think, as part of her story.
Yeah, she did guide one. I can't remember the infantry that she did, but the 38th Infantry had Kathy Williams, who went in as William Kathy. And then so there was a couple, that were hidden in there. Of course, the women always were in the background to, assist and do some Red Cross and so on, but it would have been nice if we had thrown one female into the 54th, and just kind of hit her in there a little bit. But it happens,
Yeah.
Here out of Massachusetts, we have a lot of women who, of all races, who changed their names and went into the military under their brothers' names. So think about that. Do a female veteran.
We have an audience question for Ed. Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, and Andre Braugher play very different characters. How did you think about what characteristics of Black men, freed and enslaved, to show in the movie? And how did each of these three actors impact how the characters were developed and ultimately portrayed?
When you have actors as gifted as you're pretty smart to listen, because they had a lot to contribute. They'd done a lot of homework. We'd read a lot about the experience of men at that time. As I said, there was a lot of oral history to base it on. So the notion of what the language sounded like even was something that we could play with. And we did a lot of improvisation. we really did try different situations as if they were doing tasks or working around or doing the manual of arms as they had to train, because they had to train together to learn to do those things. And that helped evolve certain kinds of scenes. But the greatest improvisations, frankly, are during the shout, because nobody really knows what a shout sounded like. We had a lot of things we had read. A lot of the guys had begun singing when I made them make them stand out in the rain, and they would sing rain, 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 you know, and they would improvise. And it came the night we weren't planning to shoot it. Something else wasn't ready. We began to work on it as this improvisation. And Morgan Freeman had done a play at BAM called The Gospel of Colonus. Wonderful, wonderful piece. And he had preached, and Denzel had grown up listening to that. And I had written a certain number of things in that scene, but that was only to try to give these guys a springboard to let the Spirit move them. And a lot of what they discovered in those scenes were their own words.
Wow. Another audience question, I'll address this one to Leon. Lincoln's views on slavery evolved over his lifetime. As late as 1858, Lincoln did not think people of color were his equal. How did the 54th impact his views leading to the 13th Amendment?
I'm not sure how
And
much.
for that matter, the 14th and 15th.
I'm not sure how much the 54th impacted his view, because from what I understand, if there had been a way to keep the nation as a whole without freeing, the slaves, then that would have been the priority and the approach. I think the fact that the 54th was able to prove that, we're no less a man, we're no less a citizen, we're no less a patriot, was very important. And that had to impact the views of anyone who was looking to make a decision about, people of color and slavery in general at that point. So I guess is that, yes, it was impactful. I'm sure there are detailed stories about how it changed the direction, of the country. But, there was not an intent that, this war was going to necessarily lead to a unique kind of freedom for, enslaved persons and people of color. That wasn't necessarily the objective initially. That was an outcome.
Right.
It had an impact.
And what do you think was the legacy of the 54th Regiment ultimately? What does the story all mean?
Well, the story all means, as I said earlier, racism as an issue was never dealt with in its most direct possible way. What we wind up, today. I mean, we can look at what happened in Washington. There is still a profound belief that there were citizens of this country or less than. You can go off and fight for your country. You can prove that you're a more than willing and able warrior and a patriot. And at the end of the day, you still wind up with an issue of, let's pay you less than the person standing across from you. I mean, this came out in the film. And as I watched the film, it just made me, some of it made me angry. Not about, the depiction in the film. It just brought back some of those atrocious feelings that come with having to deal with the atrocities of being who you are and the atrocities of racism. And watching it a second time was profoundly wise to do. And I'm glad I did it, but it just tells us the story of where we are today and how difficult it is to deal with an issue that has not been openly confronted right up until today.
Right.
And what we have in the museum are a lot of pieces that tell that story.
Leon, would you mind? Wouldn't you think that the 54th Regiment was more honored and accepted more than our Vietnam brothers? If you look at how
Yes.
the treatment, you know what I'm saying?
Yes,
So,
yes. I remember as a young soldier getting that uniform off as quickly as I could when I came home.
I mean, there was, what's happened even in any wars, really, there's been so much less clarity as to why we are there in the first place. The clarity that it transcends even issues of race. It's geopolitical lack of explanation and clarity and resources and so many things that now have made that a much more contorted view on the part of the public as to why we are fighting. And in that sense, the movie describes people who know why they are fighting.
Yeah.
For whatever reasons, they're different, but they know.
It's a bitter pill to swallow to recognize that parents of many of us, or in some cases, grandparents of many of us, joined a segregated army.
Yep.
Segregated armed forces, and dealt with that. And I think when you just think of the recency of that, we're talking about people that you have talked to over the past, let's just say 10, 20 years, who were in a war zone and were in a segregated army. But once again, much like the 54th, went off to serve the country and proudly, and came back to some treatment that was utterly unacceptable, but one that had to be dealt with. And we probably evolved well beyond that. But the recency of some of these things that are painful is what the film brought back to me. Some of those things were just too recent.
Ed, I want to give you the last word. It's 3:44. About the legacy of the 54th Regiment and the story told in this film.
Well, it's funny. As history is taught less and less well, it's befallen certain films to take on, the role of the permanent record. And there's so many movies that try to boulderize and really try, sort of just gin up the history and not make it true. And I think the idea that this is a story that is a true American story and deserve to be told, I think that's what it is as a movie. In terms of the 54th, I couldn't have said it better than Leon said it. That they continue to evoke emotion in us because of the circumstance that our country is in still, and the idea that they fought for something, for a vision and a promise that has yet to find its full expression, and never more so has that been more vivid than right now.
So true. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank our panelists for our wonderful discussion. Producer and director Ed Zwick, Leon Wilson, the president of the Museum of African American History, and Maris Tuitt, commander of the William E. Carter Post 16 in Mattapan. And I'd like to thank all of you, especially for joining us today for this installment of the Boston Globe's African American History Film Festival. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Nice doing it.